You ever have some of these before? Assuming you live in a developed nation, you've eaten at least one of these golden crispy potato shreds at least once before in your life. After all, America alone has consumed 1.85 billion pounds of potato chips within the last year. You can find this great snack anywhere today, from Super Bowl parties to the side of a nice club sandwich. Throw a stone and you'll find a place that serves potato chips. Potato chips are one of the most popular snacks in the world. And wouldn't you believe it, they were invented right here in Saratoga Springs. This is the site of Moon's Lake House, right over the lake here. The historical record isn't 100% clear about the origins of the potato chip, but a set of legends has cropped up around Saratoga and the surrounding areas. But before we talk about the legends, let's talk about what we definitively know, what the historical record says. The first known instance of potato chips was in the 1817 cookbook, The Cook's Oracle, which described a method fairly similar to how chips are made today. But the legends that cropped up in more recent times involve this place here, Moon's Lake House, which is currently a house now, but visible beyond the trees right there is the former remains of Moon's Lake House. The cook at this restaurant was named George Speck, also known as George Crumb. Now, his life isn't super well documented, but we do have a fair amount to go on. We know that he was born in Saratoga County sometime around 1824, and we know that his parents were both African American and Mohawk Indians. We know that he worked as a chef in many restaurants around Saratoga and Ballston Spa, and later opened up his own place in Malta. We'll get to you later. But we know definitively that he worked at Moon's Lake House sometime around 1850. This doesn't really line up with the Cook's Oracle's release date, but I think that it was a case of parallel thinking. There are many cases where people invent similar things with no input from each other. Most famously, calculus was invented in two separate countries by two separate people. Now that all the facts are laid out, I think we should take a look at the legends that Saratogians have been taught for their whole lives. With the actual historical register being so scattered, the Saratogians have put together a folkloric version of events for the creation of the potato chip. So let's see how that story plays out. On a nice afternoon on Saratoga Lake, people are dining at the prestigious Moon's Lake House. The chef, George Crumb, was working hard on this busy day. One of the dishes he had many orders for that afternoon was the trendiest dish that the upper classes couldn't get enough of: French fries. Fresh out of Europe, French fries were the big new trend in the culinary world. They were much harder to cook back then, as potatoes had to be cut by hand and fried in a shallow pan of oil. So Crumb was hard at work, cutting up potatoes and frying them into crispy strips, all while the rest of the kitchen scrambled to fill orders. As Crumb was cutting up more fries, a waiter comes in and tells him that a customer wants to speak to him. The waiter walks to the table and sees none other than Cornelius Vanderbilt, a railroad tycoon who was one of the richest men in the world at the time. Now, Vanderbilt had a history here at Moon's. He was a regular who loved Crumb's cooking. Despite this, he could never remember George's name. He even gave George Speck his nickname Crumb after misremembering his name as such, and George took it because he said that a crumb is bigger than a speck. Anyways, Vanderbilt told Crumb that he didn't like the fries, and he asked for them to be remade, thinner and crispier this time. Crumb bitterly took the fries back to the kitchen, feeling his cooking was just insulted. Nevertheless, he went back to the kitchen and made Vanderbilt his new fries. He cut the potatoes thinner this time and threw them in the oil. They crisped up a lot more, but they still had a fluffy inside. Crumb brought the crispier fries out to Vanderbilt. He went back to the kitchen, and not a minute later, the waiter told him that Vanderbilt wanted the fries even thinner. Crumb went into a fit of rage. Not only had his dish been insulted, he even modified it specifically for Vanderbilt, and he still hated it. This time, Crumb was going to take Vanderbilt's words as literally as possible. He cut the potato slices super thin enough that they were partly see-through. He threw them into the pan and listened to them sizzle as they crisped up. He pulled them out when they were completely hardened and nearly burnt. He ran out of the kitchen with his new dish and plopped it in front of Vanderbilt. He stood and waited as he watched Vanderbilt take the first bite. Sharp crackling filled the air as he chewed. Crumb watched gleefully, ready to see the fool eat his words. Vanderbilt swallowed as George stared, ready to be proven right. and Cornelius opened his mouth. "These are perfect. Thank you." Flabbergasted, Crumb went back into the kitchen and made himself some more chips, and to his utter disbelief, they tasted amazing. He had just created a brand new dish, his signature Saratoga chip. Sometime later, Crumb left Moon's to start his own restaurant, Crumb's Place. And at Crumb's Place, every table had a big bowl of potato chips for everyone. And here I am at Crumb's Place, the restaurant where Crumb worked for about 30-ish years after leaving Moon's Lake House. The historical records aren't the most clear. It's just a stone foundation left now, and it is covered by snow, but that gated portion is where the restaurant used to be. The romanticized version of events is that George Crumb got so big and popular after creating the Saratoga chip that he was able to get enough money to build his own restaurant, and judging by the fact that I'm standing in front of it, that version of events is at least partly true. I want to talk about a couple things that I don't think added up in the legendary version that we just saw. First off, I don't think the customer was Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was definitely a patron to Moon's Lake House before, but there's no real evidence stating that he was responsible for the creation of the chip. It's likely that this version of the story was created because it's simply more interesting to have the world's richest man be credited for a new creation than just some random guy who thought his fries were too thick. Now, another big claimant to the legend of the potato chip is Crumb's sister, Catherine Hicks. She stated in an interview around the 1930s that she created the potato chip by accident after slicing potatoes. One of them fell in the oil, and Crumb liked them enough to put them on the menu. Now, this is certainly possible. We can't say for sure, and if she is the true creator of the potato chip, it wouldn't have been the first time women were erased from history and had their credits taken by a man. But there's no way we can say for sure. Alright, it's getting pretty cold out here. Let's go back. Whew, much better. So today, we've seen the story of one of the most popular snacks in American history, and one of the greatest claims to fame for the town of Saratoga Springs. The story of an angry chef who accidentally created one of the greatest snacks mankind has ever eaten. We've also seen how, over the decades, facts can become warped and stories can evolve into their own things. But if you still like the story of George Crumb that you've heard before, then there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes if you see a story that's too good to be true, then you should look into it. You should try to see if it is factual. Sometimes they are, but a lot of the times they aren't. The story of George Crumb is no doubt fun, but he was probably a very different man than the stories would lead you to believe. Just keep an eye out for any apocryphal tales that seem too good to be true. A story doesn't need to be completely factual to be a good story, but you should be critical of stories you hear before pushing them around as fact. Anyways, thank you all for watching. Now let's indulge in the fine Saratoga delicacy.